and alternative investment show. I promised you earlier this week that I was going to bring you a very special guest, and here he is, Mr. John Adams. He is an economist. And right now, I think it's the time. I'm always saying to you guys out there, I'm saying you've got to be resourceful. You've got to get educated. There's no better person to educate us on what is happening in the economy, not just here in Australia, but globally. And I am talking today to John on the day of the US elections, which quite frankly has been all over the shop, but it's looking interesting at the moment. John, welcome to the show. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, John, you've said in the past that Australia really is going to be looking towards a recession, if not a depression. And you've also suggested that Australia's debt is extraordinarily high and that Australians as a whole need to wake up. Are you still standing by that? We've got a pandemic on our hands, and right now we've got JobKeeper, JobSeeker, JobMaker. Government is handing out money hand over fist. How will that impact the general population, and should they be concerned?
Sure. So probably a couple of points, Kerry. The first one is that I did say, starting back in 2016, that we had the biggest debt bubble on record, and that still stands in terms of household debt. And I did say we were going to have a day of reckoning. And I would say that I think for a lot of Australians, that day of reckoning has come in some form or another in 2020 with COVID-19 and the lockdown. It is true that some of the day of reckoning has been shielded a bit with the stimulus, JobKeeper, JobSeeker, etc. And as we are in the last quarter of the calendar year, as these payments have been reduced, and they were reduced at the end of September, that is definitely causing more people to suffer more hardship as we move towards Christmas. The government, as well as the Reserve Bank of Australia, are forecasting for unemployment to rise from where we are now. And I have heard, even anecdotally, that white-collar workers in, say, the construction sector in Sydney have been given redundancy notices starting November because the pipeline has reduced. So, so I would say that day of reckoning is happening in some shape and form in 2020. Now, I did say that in 2018, in a column for news.com.au, I did talk about the 6 scenarios of economic Armageddon. Now, some of them were recession, depression type scenarios. Some of them were more inflationary, stagflation, hyperinflation, etc. And those sort of latter category of scenarios was really more concerned about what would happen in terms of a policy response when we get an economic shock. And what we've seen in 2020 is that we've had an economic shock, and we've had the most unprecedented amount of fiscal and monetary stimulus in the history of Australia. And kind of like you said, we're here talking on a Wednesday on the day of the US election, and only in the last 24 hours, the RBA came out with the most radical and drastic monetary stimulus package in the history of the country, and that is going to cause huge problems going forward. So yes, whilst quite a few millions of people across the country have been severely impacted, some in very drastic form, particularly in Victoria, the stimulus has shielded some of the pain, but that pain will manifest itself in different forms going into 2021 and beyond. And just to give an example, so one of my scenarios was stagflation.
Yeah,
we haven't seen stagflation since the 70s. I mean, I've been saying since about July, August that I think we've got stagflation now. The Keynesian economic textbook basically has always said that if you have a recession, prices should be falling because of a deficit of aggregate demand. Well, throughout 2020, we're seeing that prices in many regards are holding up, and sometimes in some aspects they're actually cost of living is actually getting worse, particularly around food. And this is all happening when unemployment is up, underemployment is up, and incomes have been compressed because of the lockdown and because of the recession. So I think middle class Australians are getting squeezed. and that will be that started to intensify at the beginning of October when the keeper and seeker was reduced, and I think that's going to continue through to Christmas and beyond.
John, you just mentioned the fact that the Reserve Bank have reduced interest rates yet again to unprecedented lows, and you said that that's going to hurt people. Why do you say that? I would have thought that that's going to encourage people to take out loans and mortgages, and quite frankly, right now people seem to not be concerned about it. They're going, well, more cheap money. We can go on a bit of a tear, and property prices seem to be going up. Why do you think people need to be cautious about that reduction in interest rates?
Sure. So yes. So probably a couple of points. The first one is that in the course of human history, you've never solved a debt bubble with trying to inject more debt into a bubble. So trying to pump more debt into the system to keep the debt bubble afloat and to expand it, and that's how we've been trying to generate economic growth. I mean, that's not a healthy recipe in terms of future prosperity. The big concern I have, and here's where the RBA, as well as the mainstream media, haven't actually explained to the public, is how do we actually reverse this? So, if you look at the last 20, 30 years, we've had times where interest rates have gone up, interest rates have gone down, and now where the policies are so extreme. When you look at quantitative easing, or what the RBA calls yield curve control, where they're basically trying to buy government bonds at certain maturities to keep them at a very low rate of 0.1%. You've got the official interest rates at 0.1. You've got this term funding facility that's basically the banks. The RBA is giving credit to the commercial banks at 0.1%, which is much cheaper than what the wholesale international credit market is giving. And the thing is, so a couple of things. So this will cause inflation, because how are we financing all of this is through money printing. Now, so typically what happens is the inflation typically will come in slow and a slow amount and over a gradual process. But then you reach a point in which particularly the international credit markets lose confidence in your currency because you've created too much of it. And we had a balance of payments crisis in the Great Depression, where we borrowed too much money from London, and people in London basically had no confidence in our ability to repay that money back, and that's what happened. So what happened in Greece in 2012? They had a sovereign debt crisis. The government basically had an issue with its finances that led to a balance of payments crisis and its ability to borrow from other European nations. That's exactly what Australia went through in the Great Depression. And then when we look at what happened to the Hawke-Keating government in 1985-86, was that the dollar fell about 25% over the course of 12 months. And then the market in 1986 was basically signaling concerns about the amount of money printing that was happening under the Hawke-Keating government, and the ability for us to meet our international financial obligations. And that's when Keating had to speak about the Banana Republic in an interview with John Laws, and he had to bring down a tough budget in August of 1986 to provide the market with some international confidence. So the money printing. So in the short term, it will help. Particularly with households who have the ability to refinance mortgages that can get low interest rates. That will help on a cash flow basis. That will help shield some of the pain for the rest of 2020 into 2021. But the inflation will come. And if we ever try to raise interest rates or to reverse quantitative easing because we want to get on top of the inflation, well, we've got buckets of doing that without causing a depression. So you think about it, with the quantitative easing, what have we done? We've bought, so in order to suppress the bond yields, so there's an inverse relationship between bond prices and bond yields. So to push the bond yields to record lows, the bond prices have to be at record highs. And so how these prices at record highs? The RBA goes into the secondary market and buys them at a inflated price, at a price more so than what the private market wants to set. So if it ever wants to sell these bonds back into the market, it actually has to, no one in the private market is going to buy the bonds at the price that the RBA bought them at, and obviously that means that bond prices has to fall and bond yields have to go up. And this is the problem. What the Americans faced, it was they did QE from 2008 to 2014. Then they started quantitative tightening, and they got to a point in 2018 where the market was saying that interest rates are too high, and then the stock market started to fall away, and there was huge pressure in the financial markets. And then they basically had the reverse course, and now they're back into QE and back at 0% interest rate. So I've always said that once you start quantitative easing, because you're effectively manipulating the price of the bonds, relative to the free market price, you can never go back. And then in terms of interest rates, if we start to raise interest rates, 70% of the mortgage market is on variable interest. And if you try to raise interest rates, I dare say that a lot of households would not be able to afford the high interest costs, even if they've only got an interest-only loan. And obviously the big concern is that if you did start to raise interest rates, you're going to see a lot of defaults happening on these mortgages. It brings the banking system into into a crisis mode. The property market will be extraordinarily weak, on the verge of collapse. And basically, if they continue to tighten policy, we'll have the biggest depression in Australian history.
But
if they try to save the property market.
Yeah, but that's the point, John. I mean, the Reserve Bank governor came out only yesterday and said, we are going to be in a low interest rate environment, not just, for the short term, but he's seeing it in a much longer term. So, he said to the market, we are not going to raise interest rates in the short or medium term.
So what we know through world history is that this sort of policy action, which I should say that in the course of Australian history, we've never attempted before. And I should say that on a global basis, world central banks have never done what we're doing right now. Anything close to this has led to runaway inflation and hyperinflation. So the question is that how they're going to keep confidence in the currency, how they're going to keep inflation under control when they're just creating creating more and more dollars through all of this artificial counterfeit money.
Well, a lot of central banks are getting together, and the IMF has come out and said that a new monetary policy, a new Bretton Woods style monetary policy will be ahead of us. There's talk about everything going digital, which I said yesterday, we're going to lose our freedom and our liberty because everything will be very controlled. I'd be interested in your thoughts on some of that, and will that impact us here in Australia, and should we be concerned?
Yes. So very, very good question. In the last week, so I'm actually writing an article about central bank digital currencies, and I found a whole bunch of technical papers from the IMF and the BIS, the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, the Reserve Bank of Canada, the RBA as well. So I've started to delve into some of the technical documents. So it would appear that they are going down the digital currency route. Part of the reason is that they want to push for negative interest rates, and they need to abolish cash in terms of physical cash. So some of the audience, if your audience is Australian, they may be aware that there was some controversial legislation last year pushed by the Morrison government about making cash transactions above $10,000 to be illegal. I led the charge on that through a YouTube campaign. I put in a detailed submission. I was able to testify to the Senate committee in January of this year. And so far, that legislation hasn't seen the light of day. So
congratulations, John. Well done, because that has not seen the light of day.
No. So what happened was that the Senate committee handed down its inquiry report. The assistant treasurer still to this day. So the report was handed down in February. Here we are into November. The assistant treasurer has not responded to the report, and we have had no confirmation from the government that they are going to pursue it. So it's still on the statute books. It still has the opportunity to be passed by the Senate, but so far they're just it's just sitting there. And I think part of the reason why is because of the whole COVID-19, and that's sort of distracted the entire agenda. But so far we've had a minor victory on that. But I should say that some central banks have said that these central bank digital currencies, they come in multiple forms. There's a range of design options that central banks can pursue. Some of them look at a wholesale currency, which is between basically the Reserve Bank and the commercial banks. And then you've got a retail level digital currency, which is available to everyone. So the RBA only in the last 2 days has said they're looking at a project of a wholesale central bank digital currency. Now, when you're looking at a retail level, quite a few central banks around the world have said, if we implement a retail level digital currency, we're going to do this that coincides with physical cash. So we're going to basically have a dual system, but they're basically going to be the same thing. It's still our national currency, but part, you can have it in the physical form, you can have it in digital form, and the digital form can be in a wallet, in a digital wallet that you can use your phone or a smart device to actually conduct transactions. And there is a big issue with liberty because people can be manipulated into doing certain things to get access to the money, or if there is helicopter money through universal basic income, then that money, then basically they can put conditions to say, if we give you $100, this is the way you're going to spend the $100. Otherwise, you're not going to get any money from the government. So there are some huge concerns about freedom. But as long as I would say that if physical cash is still in existence, you still have a chance of retaining some privacy, and you still have the ability to do things without being controlled by the state. The unfortunate thing,
but John, most people now, like my son and that sort of the next generation down, this tap and go, most of them never carry cash, they never use cash, they've almost gone digital anyway. It's only for sort of my generation and maybe yours that even care about cash. Is there an issue if cash disappears and we go fully digital? I believe there is, because I believe that it is a loss of freedom, a loss of liberty. But that's, some people will look at me and say that I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist, but I just feel that it does give us a loss of freedom. But our next generation, they don't seem to worry about it.
Well, so one of the reasons why the next generation isn't concerned is because they can do tap and go and no one's telling them what to do with their money. So at the point at which people say you can only tap and go under certain conditions, I mean, that's where I think you're gonna get some resistance. So the other point I will make is, and this is just the point I wanted to finish up on, right, on my previous answer, is while central banks around the world have said they're happy to have a retail digital currency that's sits in parallel with physical cash, Australia actually has said something very different. The RBA put out a publication in September in which they said that it would be too inefficient and too costly to run a dual system. So they said, we have no plans currently to implement a retail digital currency, but if we did, we're going to eliminate cash. So the RBA has said this on the record, and they say, well, no plans yet, but if we do it, we're going to go the whole hog. Well, having studied the RBA very closely over the last few years, it seems like a very typical pattern. They introduce a concept, they say we have no plans to do this, and then obviously, all of a sudden they just change their mind and they just do it. So let me give you a classic example. The Philip Lowe, I think it was at the end of last year, gave a speech about unconventional monetary policy, talked about negative interest rates, said we have no plans for negative interest rates in Australia. They said they've analysed the experience of Europe and Japan, and they don't think it's a good idea. And here we are 11 months on, and the RBA saying, well, if the other major countries around the world are going negative, we're going to go negative too. So I do think we're going to see a retail central bank digital currency issued by the RBA in the next 5 years. I think they're going to attempt to eliminate cash. And then the question will be is, well, how do people respond to that? I think a lot of Australians have been shocked with the actions of the Victorian government during this lockdown.
Absolutely.
I mean, so people have criticised me on social media because I've compared Victoria to East Germany. But when you've got curfews, when you've got checkpoints, the South Australian emergency COVID-19 legislation provided the ability to confiscate children. The Western Australian
say that again, John. Sorry, say that again.
About the South Australian COVID-19 emergency legislation gave the government the power to confiscate children. So basically, there's a section in the Act which says that if if an authorized officer believes that a child is at risk, that authorized officer has the ability to remove that child and relocate that child to wherever the government wants that child to go. So that was passed by the South Australian Parliament this year. There is legislation in the books, I think, from memory, passed by the Western Australian government in 2016, where they basically say that without your consent, they can force you to take a vaccine, and it's a criminal act not to take the vaccine. So there are elements of the most disturbing totalitarian legislation going through some of our state parliaments, and obviously we've seen a whole host of actions that are happening in Victoria, which are completely inconsistent with the Australian character, and I think it's shocked a lot of Australians as to how far Daniel Andrews and the police have gone, particularly when, in my view, COVID-19 does not pose a risk that requires that sort of response. And I was listening to a podcast by one of Britain's top lawyers only the other day, and they basically said that you look at the history of England, whether in wartime or during previous pandemics, and what we've done in 2020, whether in the UK or Australia, it is unprecedented. We've never quarantined the healthy. We've always quarantined the sick. And these lockdowns, these social distancing rules, etc. These are things that have never been implemented before in Western democracies, and I absolutely think that they shouldn't be tolerated. But I think to a certain extent, the majority of Australians have accepted these because they've accepted the risk of COVID-19. And I think when you look at some of the results of the state and territory elections, so we've had 3 incumbent governments being re-elected, so Northern Territory, ACT, and Queensland. And so I think on the whole, people have accepted the establishment narrative on COVID-19 and the need for in terms of the need for some of these lockdown measures. But I dare say that if the RBA attempts to remove cash holus bolus, that could be a whole different kettle of fish going forward.
Why do you think governments are getting out of control, and the people, it's like the frog in the boiling water. We as the citizens are going, it's not so bad, it's not so bad, it's not so bad. And then when it becomes, as you say, totalitarian and your freedoms and liberties, you go, well, it's too bad, because once they're gone, they're gone.
Yeah, look, so do I think the politicians are out of control? Absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing a number of clear examples of corruption. The hotel quarantine thing. I mean, it's remarkable how you've got multiple ministers, the Premier, multiple senior bureaucrats saying, I don't know who authorized the hotel quarantine. I mean, look, an absolute joke. I mean, you've got the New South Wales Premier who broke her own ministerial code of conduct. I mean, she's required under her own code to disclose the interests of any intimate partners. And she got a lawyer to basically say that, that Daryl Maguire was not her intimate partner because they didn't have a joint financial account. And yet she said on the record that she loved him, she wanted to marry him. I mean, when you say you love someone and you want to marry them, I mean, that to me is I think the pub test. They're intimate. And yet, you get a lawyer saying, well, she didn't have to disclose his interests because they didn't have a joint bank account. It was completely farcical. So we're seeing multiple examples. And then obviously at the federal level, we saw in terms of land at Badgerys Creek being bought at 10 times its commercial value, and water rights, and a whole bunch of other things which are bringing big questions as to, well, how is our government being run? Look, I used to work in federal politics, and
I was going to say, John, I think it'd be really important for those listeners that don't know, you do have a background in federal politics. If you could just cover that briefly for us, so because you do have a really good understanding about not just economics, but how governments work and how they can impact, the everyday man on the street.
Sure, yes. So I've had a long and interesting career. So I've worked as a bureaucrat in Canberra, as well as in Sydney for the New South Wales government. I've worked as a management consultant for a Big Four accounting firm, consulting to government across a whole host of portfolios and projects. I was an economic advisor in federal parliament to Arthur Sinodinos, who's now Australia's ambassador to the United States, and got to work for him for about 18 months and got to see how parliament works from the inside. And since I left a formal role in terms of the federal parliament, I mean, I am regularly in Canberra talking to politicians. So I get to have a ongoing dialogue in terms of what they're thinking, what they're hearing, and obviously I express my views on economics and politics, the whole host of things. And I've done some consulting work for some people out of the WA Parliament as well. So so I engage parliamentarians quite often, and there's a lot of ignorance. There's a lot of weak people who are not willing to take any controversial stands, and we're headed towards a very dangerous path. And I think some of these ministers and some of these political leaders are just, I think they've lost touch with where the public sentiment is.
I think I tend to agree with you, because they are called public servants, but they're no longer serving the public. They're serving their own greater interests, I guess. But is the system so entrenched now that it would be hard to I guess, break it and make it better for the people? Because at the moment, I can't see them serving the people as public servants. It's more politics rather than serving the people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I do believe that if you had different type of people in Parliament, could the system change? Could you get a different type of politics? I still have confidence that we can do that. Now, one of the interesting things I will say is that when it comes to, for example, the federal budget and monetary policy and this debt bubble and a few other sort of aspects, I mean, when I talk to politicians about austerity and the need to run a conservative budgetary policy in terms of having a budget surplus, cutting spending, raising interest rates, and having more stable macroeconomic foundations. And obviously people want to understand, well, what are the implications? We go through the implications, which are quite horrendous because of how indebted people are. So people have said to me, well, if we ever attempted to do anything like that, we can't win the next election.
Exactly.
But here's the thing. So if anyone's interested, I do a regular show with Martin North on YouTube called In the Interest of the People. And we just released a episode this morning in which the episode is only the 10th Prime Minister, only our 10th Prime Minister can save Australia. And the 10th Prime Minister was Joseph Lyons, who was Prime Minister during the Great Depression and into the 1930s. And, the remarkable thing about him was he went to the 1931 election with a explicit austerity agenda. And, he didn't hide it. It was quite explicit. And he won the biggest victory in Australian history. So the two-party preferred was 58.5. And this is one of the things I say to politicians who say we can't win if we actually tell the public the truth and actually try to correct the problem. I say, well, there's one person in Australian history who did it, and they won the biggest victory. So, now
yes,
there are
but John, I have to say that back in those days, in the 30s, there wasn't as much money printing. There wasn't as many handouts from the government. I mean, right now, we all know that there's a majority of people, there's a large number of people that are getting job seeker or job keeper, and, they love the government because they're getting free money. But how much longer can that go on for? But I do think we're living different times from the 30s, where the printing machine is going 24/7 and people are loving it because they get paid more to sit at home and do nothing. The productivity is going down, our debts are going up. Is there a way out in your view? Because I don't think I think it's a different kettle of fish in 2020.
Well, yes. So there are some. I mean, so I regularly go to the University of Wollongong and have some conversations with some of the political scientists there, and they've made the same argument you've made, which is Australia in 1931 was vastly different than the Australia of 2020, and we've had conversations about what's similar and in terms of what is different. So I mean, there could be a case to be made there, but the point I would make, Kerry, is that when politicians say to me we can't do it because we can't win the argument, well, part of the, for example, let me give you a bit of a crude example. Like take a young guy who's interested in a female. A guy may say to himself, if I don't, I'd like to ask this lady out, but I'm never going to ask because I know she's going to say no. Well, sometimes, you don't know, you can talk yourself into an answer, but sometimes if you actually go ask the question, maybe you actually get a different result. And this is the sort of argument I will say to politicians. Well, no one has attempted to explain the problem to the public. No one has actually attempted to actually provide the options and actually say this is the path we need to go forward. Now, it could well be that Australians are too reliant on the government and people love all this free money and they're not going to change their ways. And if a political party or a prime minister or a leader of the opposition attempted this, then it would be a catastrophic electoral defeat. I mean, that's possible. But on the other hand, it could actually be, a different result could happen. But the basic point is, if no one attempts to make the argument in terms of the political class, if we don't change policy, we're headed towards runaway inflation.
John, if you were in the driver's seat then, and you had the opportunity to say, to articulate here is the problem, here is the best solution, what would you say to the Australian public on that right now, where we are?
So the first thing is that, and one of the things that I've been trying to do over the last 4 years is explain the nature of the problem. So we have the biggest debt bubble in the history of the country. It's completely unsustainable. The reason why it hasn't collapsed so far is because we're doing the most radical stimulus policies known to man, where there's about running deficits of $213 billion, which is the federal deficit this year, or in terms of having interest rates at 0.1%. We're doing radically different things in order to keep the show going. Now, I'd explain the problem and how this problem has manifested itself. I would also explain the consequences of the path that we're on, because most Australians have no idea the consequences of too much debt, the consequences of too much money printing and ultra low interest rates. So I think explaining the consequences is important. And then obviously, saying, well, money doesn't grow on trees. You don't solve the debt problem by adding more debt. And we have to come to terms with the state of the economy, and we actually have to reverse course. So what does that mean? It means that we have to raise interest rates. We have to encourage savings. We have to provide disincentives around too much debt. We need to balance the federal budget. We need to slash government spending. We need to reform the tax system. We need to become more competitive, drive productivity higher, which means that we need to drive energy costs down, labor costs down, and we need to diversify the economy away from housing and mass immigration. We need to have manufacturing. We need to reform the banking system. So one of the biggest problems with the banking system is we have a too big to fail problem with the big four banks. So I do think we need to restructure the banks, and maybe rather than having 4 oligopolies, we should probably have 8 sort of size banks or something of that nature, so that if one bank goes, the whole system's not going to crash. And 65 to 70% of bank lending is for housing. So we need to basically change the credit models inside the banks and say that you can provide credit to households, but you need to provide a much larger percentage of credit to the business community, particularly small to medium-sized businesses, because that's where most of the growth comes from. And we need to actually find ways to encourage entrepreneurs to attract capital, whether it's through debt or equity, to finance their ideas, and so that we can build goods and services that are in demand from around the world, and we can run large trade surpluses that allows us to pay back some of this foreign debt. So I mean, from an economic point of view, the solution is not that hard to come up with. Now, it's hard to implement, it's hard to explain. Obviously, changing a national culture is a very hard task, and it does take a number of years to start to get the results. But it's kind of like with anything. I mean, if you're willing to be disciplined, if you follow the right steps, you can get the right result.
But it's like dare I say it, it's like somebody on crack. They've got a good feeling while the drug is coming in the terms of the payments from the government. I'm feeling good. I'm getting my 3,000 or whatever it is on the job keeper. Can you see anybody getting into government that turns around and says, do you know what? I'm going to take away your drug. You're going to do it tough. Going to do it tough for the next few years. Vote me in. You know,
So the short answer is I can't see anyone yet doing that. I would say never. Could someone emerge? Maybe. But I would say is one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire conversation, Kerry, is throughout 2020, we have seen an almost universal consensus, which is a pro-stimulus consensus. So you think about government, the bureaucrats, the mainstream media, the commercial banks, academics, think tanks, consulting companies like Deloitte Access Economics, independent commentators, etc. They've all been pushing the pro-stimulus angle, and there's been not much dissent on the other side. Now, the reason why that's dangerous is that there was the same universal consensus was also around in Germany in 1921, 22, 23.
wow.
And basically the government, got out of control with the money printing, and as a result, Germany had hyperinflation. So one of the reasons why Joseph Lyons in 1931 went to the electorate with an austerity package was because he and a number of people in Australia were concerned that Australia could repeat the mistakes of Germany. So now one of the problems is that given that German hyperinflation happened about a century ago, a lot of Australians are saying, well, that's then, this is now. Germany's one proposition, we're a completely different proposition. You can't compare the two. People tend to be quite myopic, short term, not fully across the historical parallels. So there's a very big risk that we're going to repeat the mistakes of a Germany or a Venezuela or a Zimbabwe. But there's also a possibility that some people across the country can start to make the case, change people's perspectives, and enough of us can sort of come together that we can start to change the political discourse in Australia, and then from there, who knows what could happen.
Couple more questions for you, John. What are the consequences if we do nothing but continue stimulus in the way we have over the past year or so?
So ultimately, what we're going to be headed towards, we're going to head towards a balance of payments crisis. So we've got one of the largest foreign debts in our history. So at some point, our foreign creditors are going to say, we don't have the confidence you're going to repay the debt that you owe us. So if we just try to borrow more and more money, at some point the international credit card is going to be maxed out. If we try to print a way out of it, our foreign creditors are going to say, we're not going to accept you to repay this debt in Australian dollars, which have been cheapened. And then we're going to start to see pressure on the Australian dollar in the foreign exchange markets. And if the dollar does crash, then you're going to start to see inflation become a huge problem. And this is exactly what's happened, say, in Turkey today. The lira has been falling for a number of years, and it's at all-time low now. And cost of living pressures in Turkey are quite astronomical. And the reason is that the big debt bubble in Turkey is corporate debt. So they borrowed huge amounts, particularly from European banks. And European banks and international rating agencies have said, we don't think you can pay back this debt. And that's why the Turkish lira has been marked down, because the government and central bank have tried to paper over some of these debt bubbles by domestic macroeconomic policy, and Turkey is basically in a huge pickle. So I think we're going to have a balance of payments crisis that's going to turn into a crisis of the currency. We're going to see runaway inflation, and then we have a choice. If we let the currency go, we're going to have hyperinflation, just like what happened in Germany. If we try to address, the problem at that point, that's when you have to dramatically raise interest rates to defend the currency. So 2 years ago, Argentina raised interest rates from 27.5% to 60% to get inflation under control. Turkey raised interest rates from 8% to 24% in 4 months to get the currency under control. So now some have alluded to an IMF bailout package, but when I've spoken to some academic experts, they've said that we're too big for the IMF to bail out. The IMF has never bailed out anyone of our magnitude. So I don't think an international bailout is possible. It's going to be the hyperinflation or a huge depression resulting from very dramatic increases in interest rates to basically stop the currency from collapsing. So that's where we're headed. What I don't know is what is the point at which the international credit markets lose confidence in us. Yeah. I mean, I would say now we can't pay back the debt, and I would say now that if you're an international institution, you're basically bonkers to give us any money because you're not going to get it back. So I would say, being an Australian patriot, I would say the best thing for Australia is for our bankers and our lenders not to lend us any more money. You talked about crack before. Now, obviously, drug dealers like addicts because they can sell more drugs to them. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think we're a debt addict, and we've got a history of being obsessed with debt. I mean, if you go back to the 1920s or even the 1880s, I mean, we've never had any sense of proportion around knowing when we've had too much debt. Kind of like with alcohol, some Australians have a problem with too much alcohol. So I would say that in order to get our country under control, if our creditors said, okay, we're not going to lend you any more money, we would have an immediate economic crisis, and that would actually help us start the rehabilitation process sooner rather than later.
All right, John, I'd like to just finish up with this. What would you say to our listeners, our viewers out there that are sitting here, have listened to this and have gone, goodness me, how do I protect my wealth in what looks to be a challenging economic time ahead?
So I mean, I put out a 10-point plan in 2018. So if anyone goes into Google, types in John Adams 10-point plan economic Armageddon, you can find the article, 10 basic steps. Some of them are around learning history, taking some financial precautions, getting out of debt, holding safe money.
Now you call safe money, I guess, gold and silver. Would you call Bitcoin safe money? No. The thing is that so to me, Bitcoin doesn't have the history of gold and silver. Now we'll be, and to be honest, as we go forward into this into the 2020s, how will Bitcoin perform, and whether it still will be accessible, given that it doesn't actually exist in the physical world. It's hard to be precise about what will happen with Bitcoin, whereas we can be quite precise about gold and silver because it's been around for so long. So I mean, that's not to say that Bitcoin may not be useful. The only thing is that if you're trying to make decisions on historical precedents, Bitcoin doesn't have a lot of history behind it. No. So doing things of like having multiple sources of income, managing your household budget on a cash flow basis to make sure that you're managing your cash flow well. I think these are very important steps. But also, I would say about I've got some steps around being physically fit, sleeping well, having a good social network. Obviously, we've seen across the country that mental health has been a huge problem. I mean, if you look at what causes mental distress, or what can alleviate mental anguish, having a good, strong social network, strong families, getting a lot of exercise, eating well, embracing spirituality, whatever that spirituality may look like. These are things that actually can help mental health, can help social health. And I think that's equally as important as financial health, because you could have all the money in the world, but if you're under a lot of stress for whatever reason, you're not going to have a very good existence. And so now, 2 years ago, people called me a doomsday merchant, a conspiracy theorist, someone not to be taken seriously.
Whereas I took a whole host of these steps that I outlined in my article and some of the talks I've given. And I can say hand on heart that in 2020, I've never gone to sleep worried about money because I have no debts. I have plenty of savings. I have a reasonably stable sort of business that I run that's been able to endure quite well because I work from home. And so far so good. And I've got 2 young kids, and we've been able to provide everything for them, and we haven't changed their routine at all this year, except for a couple of weeks where my daughter's school, because she's in kindergarten, things had to get changed because of COVID-19. But other than that, it's been smooth sailing. Whereas for a whole host of other Australians who didn't take precautions, for some people that have been wiped out, or it may take 10, 15 years for them to recover because of the scale of their debts, or because they didn't have enough contingency plans for their business operations or their jobs. So I would say that if someone says that you're paranoid, I mean, look, here's the thing, Kerry. I've had people say to me, John, I've read your articles, I've listened to some of your videos. I talk to my family, I talk to my friends. They think I'm a nutcase. Well, I would say ignore those people. Look, and you don't have to learn from me. There's a whole bunch of other people across the world who give very good explanations about the economy. A lot of history books to actually compare to. So read history, get educated, take some sound action, and make sure that a good attitude for life is hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and when the worst comes, like it has in 2020, you're able to live through it in fairly good shape, and you don't have to go through the hardship that a lot of other people across the world are going through.
John, I'm going to put a note down below, a link to your 10-point plan. You wrote that in 2018. Nothing changes in 2020. You're just saying if you follow that 10-point plan, you'll be in much better shape than those that are putting their head in the sand.
Absolutely.
How can people follow your what you do, John, and some of your writings?
Sure. So I have my own website, adamseconomics.com. I have a lot of my articles up there. There's a lot of videos that I put up there as well. So people can have a look at that. So I do videos for a number of different channels. So that's probably the first point. I am on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. People can, so I do put up posts every day of things that I observe, and sometimes I can be controversial on social media. Some people like it, some people don't, but it comes with the sort of package that I sort of put together in terms of the things I like to talk about. And then I do, I work for a gold and silver bullion dealership, As Good as Gold Australia.
Good guy.
So that they have a YouTube channel, and people can look at some of my commentary there. I have the main show I do is called In the Interest of the People with Martin North. So we do some videos there, and if people Google me, they'll see me in other places popping up, and alternatively, people can email me directly, and if they've got specific questions or they want to have a conversation by phone, happy to do that and happy to help.
John Adams, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Love to have a chat with you again in the not too distant future. I think that what you've got to say makes total sense to me, but the problem is the frogs are sitting in the slowly boiling water and not seeing it until potentially it's a little too late. Thanks for joining us today on the show.
No problems.